Can you, all right. I'm getting a green light and a thumbs up that you all can see my screen, right? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining today's conversation on confronting crisis, educational equity. As Andy mentioned, I am Natasha Webb-Prather, and before we jump into all of today's content, I want to paint a picture of who I am, where I've come from, and why this topic is so near and dear to my heart. I was born and raised in East Cleveland, Ohio, a predominantly all-Black neighborhood following the white flight of 1960s and the 70s. East Cleveland is a small community that many would characterize by its deficits. It's reported that the median household income in East Cleveland is just over $20,000, with the median home value being in the mid $50,000. Yet almost 70% of the residents in East Cleveland don't actually own their homes, they rent them. I am a product of the K through 12 public school system there, a school system where 99% of students qualify for free or reduced lunch. And though we're a community of tremendous pride in our high school football team and our marching band, unfortunately, all of our schools earn either a D or an F on the Ohio School Report Card, likely because we're riddled with below average graduation rates, and only 30% of students score proficient in the category of reading, and then only 20% score proficient in the category of math. And I lay out these figures, some would say bleak, because one may ask, how is it that I am standing here today as an assistant dean of a law school? I'd answer that question and say that it was part family, it was part grit, part opportunity, and a lot of God. My family has always wholeheartedly believed in education. My paternal grandparents were educators themselves, and both sides of my family always entrenched and instilled in me that education was important. For them, education was the way out of my community. I grew up knowing that taking honors classes and even going to college weren't options for me. They were actually mandated and expected. All of this was rooted in the premise that education was the great equalizer, that if I worked hard enough and studied hard enough, that I would somehow be on the same playing field as others who didn't grow up looking like or even living like me. But is education truly the great equalizer that many people believe it to be? While my life is a success story, I know far too many students and people and stories where education wasn't enough. Because one could question, how can something that is systematically inequitable ever create equity? So it is against that backdrop that we'll have today's discussion, one that calls us to confront the crisis of educational equity. Today's discussion will just be that, a discussion. I'm going to use the framework of Paulo Freire and his theories on education that were popularized in his text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire was a Brazilian educator and philosopher that criticized what he labeled as the traditional banking model of education. This banking model of education is that traditional relationship between teachers and students, where it positions teachers as being on the top of the hierarchy and being wise and all-knowing, and being the individual that bestows knowledge upon students who are seen as rather lower, who are passive, empty, just receptacles, designed to just merely memorize and regurgitate the information that has been provided. Freire theorized that this was an oppressive structure of education and it perpetuated oppression. And he theorized that instead, if we truly sought to liberate and to free individuals of that oppression, then we had to shift our education model into what he purported as a problem posing or even problem solving model. So today's discussion won't not be me purporting to be the expert teacher and you all participating as just passive students who know nothing. Because the reality is each of you clicked on this link to register and join this conversation because you have lived experiences as well as a wealth of knowledge about this very topic. And I hope that together we can choose to use that collective knowledge to grapple with today's topic. Read in other ways, I hope that you'll come off mute or chime in the chat box with me. So we're going to take Frede's problem posing model. This model removes the hierarchy between the teacher and student to make all parties equal. Here in this model, students are presented with a relatable worldly problem, and then they are pushed through dialogue to analyze how and why that problem exists. He argues that dialogue is integral to liberation because it requires hope, mutual trust, and critical thinking from the people involved. And dialogue creates this needed intersection between thoughtful reflection and concrete action, because having just merely one of them is not sufficient to ultimately move the needle forward. So today, we'll have a shared dialogue about the relatable worldly problem of educational inequities. So at least get the ball rolling on how we can go from being aware that a social problem exists to being committed to significant social change and human liberation in order to implement the radical solutions necessary to see that change occur. So, using this framework, here's our first point of dialogue. What do you believe contributes to educational inequality? And you can sit and ponder with that for a moment. You can, if you feel more comfortable typing your answers in the chat, feel free to use that modality. But I do believe as participants, you have the opportunity to come off mute and to chime into this conversation.
Hi, this is Alexa. And I would say just one thing, it might sound like a duh thing, but institutional history. I think just like how it was constructed and yeah.
Thank you, Alexa. I see race relationships and income, differences in school funding, the tracking in schools, yep. Keep them coming, access. I think that you all are definitely highlighting things that are true and are valid, right? Structuring funding via property taxes. Andy, did you see my slides before I shared them? Because I think you definitely are teeing up the first aspect of educational inequality that I wish to talk about. The neighborhood divide. This term is something that I've coined myself. Maybe it existed out there, but nevertheless, for my presentation, I'm going to say that I came up with it. This neighborhood divide is used to describe the differences in the quality of education and educational outcomes based upon the neighborhood in which a school is located. What high school did you go to? This question seems really to be popular here in Cincinnati. Since I've joined UC Law and have come to Cincinnati, it's been a popular question in conversation. After people ask what your name is, they inquire, kind of where are you from, what high school did you go to? And now, while Cincinnatians may have a lot of pride, I don't think that everyone who asks that question really wants to tout their school pride. But rather, they are likely asking this question because they seek information. They're trying to make an assessment about who it is that they are encountering. By asking a seemingly innocent and simple question, it gives people the opportunity to make very quick judgments about who you are, where you come from, what you're capable of, and whether you're worthy or even fit to occupy your current space. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that we'd all agree that all schools are not created equal. You all mentioned in the chat that one, educational inequity exists, but you also started to theorize around how we got there. And some of you even spoke about the very things that I'm speaking to, which are the funding inequities. So the amount of available funding to even the actual buildings and infrastructure that schools have, to the course offerings and extracurricular activities that are available, textbooks and other resources that are available to students as well as teachers. Man, even down to the school lunch, it may be different. And whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, the neighborhood in which a school is located typically weighs heavily on the quality of education of that school and its ultimate educational outcomes. We see this phenomena playing out in almost our everyday lives, right? When a family seeks to relocate to a new city, if they have children, what do they tend to do? They tend to look for communities and neighborhoods with the best school districts, right? So that their children will have better educational outcomes. It makes enough sense. But when we think about what that neighborhood then looks like with the best schools, as compared to those with the worst schools, the best schools in the neighborhoods tend to be more well kept. They have higher housing values, more jobs and economic opportunities. They likely have grocery stores and sources of entertainment and or even recreation as compared to the neighborhoods that are less similarly situated, that are riddled with schools that may be considered as failing. I experienced this firsthand growing up in East Cleveland, Ohio, and comparing what my life and even my education could have been had I grown up just a mere 15 minutes up the street. My lived experiences took on new meaning in college, as Andy indicated in his introduction. My senior thesis in college actually examined the correlation between negative neighborhood characteristics and educational outcomes. And as you can imagine, those schools that were situated in neighborhoods with higher rates of negative neighborhood characteristics, such as high rates of rentership versus home ownership, high rates of poverty, et cetera, also were performing the lowest on standardized testing. And that research ultimately showed me that my lived experience was not just mine, but something that was experienced across the nation. And I don't know if that made me feel better or feel worse about where we were. So I have some more questions for you. Have you all seen the neighborhood divide play out in your own life? If you have, I'm wondering, how has that divide impacted you? If you haven't experienced it, or if you would challenge the premise of this neighborhood divide, why do you think you haven't seen it? Why do you believe that it doesn't exist? I'd be interested to kind of grapple with that initial question before I pose a follow-up question. I see in the chat here that what high school did you grow up question definitely resonated with a few people. That question is big, and that it tends to feed a system that is built on inequality. Thank you for that feedback. So has anybody witnessed? Okay, I see Tamisha, you've said yes. Do you want to come off mute and join?
Yeah, so I'm from Hamilton, Ohio, and I lived on both the east side of Hamilton and the west side of Hamilton. And what's interesting is that on the east side of Hamilton at the time was considered the lower income side of the city. And when we moved to the west side, then there were educational opportunities from my elementary school that I received that my friends that I left behind, so to speak, they were not even available to them. An honors program for elementary school students and that type of thing. And we still talk about that to this day, how unfair it was, considering we thought that it was a citywide, event for students to grow and learn, but it was not, obviously. So yeah, I've seen it.
Thank you so much, Tamisha. And I wonder what that even does to you in your psyche, because you use the words the students I left behind, right? And so,
I say that in like quotes because with my friends, we're like, it's ridiculous, it's awful, but that is how it almost seemed that, in the light of the people that lived where we used to live versus where we moved to, you moved there, but then also in the opportunity. So that's why I just did it in air quotes, because it has become that to us.
Thank you so much. Eduardo, thank you so much for chiming in the chat. Eduardo mentioned that he grew up in New Jersey, where there were a lot of very small towns, in part due to exclusionary intentions, probably a whole conversation in itself, that he saw in his childhood that moving from one town to another made a big difference in the opportunities available to him and the assumptions of his future trajectory. Andy also chimed in that he's seen it. He was actually a beneficiary of this, right? And I think that we could probably have an elaborate conversation about those who have benefited versus those who have not had the opportunity to. But let's see here. Andy mentions that his parents bought the cheapest house that they could find in an otherwise expensive neighborhood, right? Just so that he could go to what was regarded as the best public school in the country. And that the neighborhood was very different from the neighborhood that he moved out of. Patrice is chiming in here to say that she also has had experiences in this, that her siblings and her went to different schools. Her school was always looked at as the more prestigious than her siblings, and they had vastly different educational experiences. So this seems to be resonating with so many of you, that this divide is something that is for sure evident in your lived experiences, whether your personal ones or even ones that you have observed. And so have you all thought about any ideas on how to combat this neighborhood divide? And as you mull over that question and possibly type your responses in the chat, I'll talk about what I thought I could do to combat it. So doing my research for my senior thesis propelled me to want to be a part of the solution, right? I grew up in this neighborhood divide. I lived this experience. I was a beneficiary of making it out and being on the precipice of changing my life outcomes. And so I decided that I was going to join the core for Teach for America so that I could be a part of the solution rather than just talking about the problem. I set out to be a transformative teacher, like the ones I had growing up, the ones that gave me opportunities that literally changed the trajectory of my life. Yet, I found out that though I was able to make an impact on the lives of a few students in my classroom, it felt as if my efforts were not enough, just merely working inside the classroom because it wasn't enough to counteract the structures of inequality that existed around us. So any ideas? How do we combat it? I tried to go on the inside to try to combat it. Does anybody have thoughts around how do we rectify this neighborhood divide? I think I see some people's fingers typing, and I'm going to hope that this silence is that you're pondering, because these are really big questions and they're hard. Patrice, you said, can it be rectified, right? That's the age-old question. Can these things be rectified? But I mean, is it okay that we are literally have an educational system that is on purpose creating an underclass. Can it be rectified? I would say anything can be possible, but whether are we going to actually employ the radical solutions to get there? So Tamisha is saying that maybe an approach to dismantle this neighborhood divide rests in the funding structure, that not basing school funding around property taxes. And I think that some states have tried to offset some of that by recalculating the funding structure to where it's not solely relegated to your property taxes. But I don't think that states are doing enough to try to rectify the history and the past practices of where certain neighborhoods have been and districts have been historically underfunded and resourced. Oh, Venus, you popped in with a chat to say that maybe a part of the solution or people's attempts to solve this problem is what prompted the growth in the charter school network. So trying to put higher quality education opportunities in schools in these neighborhoods, or giving students from certain neighborhoods different educational options than just their public school system. Before we transition, anyone else want to either come off mute or put anything else in the chat? I don't want to prematurely move us along.
Something was popped up.
Yeah. Andy, do you want to talk about this, or you want me to just read it?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Right.
So hold on a second. Sorry. One thing I found interesting about really sort of wealthy public schools is that the other advantage they have is parents build up these independent nonprofit foundations that they then donate money to, and it counts as tax deductible charitable giving. And so not only are they getting additional funding from property taxes, but they're getting additional funding from these endowed funds. And I've always thought it's kind of odd that these count as charitable, because they're directly benefiting in two ways. One, they're bankrolling their own kids' education. And two, they benefit by making that school even stronger through their giving. They're preserving their property values. So there's direct personal benefit from these two things. I've always thought it was worth reevaluating that. So anyway, that was the thought.
Thank you for that. I was not familiar with that concept and phenomenon. So thank you for educating us on that. And though we could probably spend the remainder of our time here talking about and drilling into the neighborhood divide, I do want us to save some time to talk about another inequity that has become even more salient in the recent years. Oh, I went backwards. There we go. And that is the digital divide. Now, this is a term that I did not come up with, so I am not going to take credit for this. This digital divide is something that in the education space may have more historically been called the homework gap. And it is a phrase that is used to capture the students who lack access to high speed and otherwise adequate internet, as well as electronic devices such as computers. Now, originally, this homework divide really impacted students and their ability to be able to complete assignments outside of the classroom if they required digital access. But we all know March of 2020 changed everything for our world, actually. But specifically, let's just stay here within the stateside, right? And so as of March 2020, when students were pushed out of the classroom and back into their home environment for online learning, now this homework gap became more than just homework, because now it was literally education in its entirety. And so students were captured and caught in this digital divide, because if you didn't have the device or the internet, how could you even access the education that was then being delivered? Because what learning can occur if you can't access any of that learning? And so let's talk more about some figures regarding the digital divide. As of 2020, and some of these numbers are actually pre-COVID, so it'll be interested to see how many students get captured at this point. But reports have found that between 15 and 16 million K through 12 public school students across our country are caught in the digital divide. And in early 2020, it was even reported that Ohio, our wonderful state here, was ranked in the top 10 states with the largest population of K through 12 students without adequate internet connection. So once again, kind of pondering that question of how can you learn what you can't access? And as with many other inequalities and inequities, this digital divide disproportionately affects Black, Latinx, and Native American students, who end up making up about 55% of the disconnected students within this 15 to 16 million number. But that group, though they make up 55% of the disconnected, they only make up about 40% of the total. And so this is where we see the disproportionate impact. And as often, we know that race as well as class cut along similar lines, because reports have also shown that the digital divide disproportionately affects students from lower income families, where about 50% of disconnected students come from families with an annual income of less than $50,000. And now, just if you thought that this digital divide was not impacting us at the post-secondary level, you've got another thing coming, because though the numbers are smaller, we still see that between 3 to 4 million students are still caught within this digital divide, with that same disproportionate impact occurring to our students of color, as well as our students from lower income families. These individuals tend to have lower quality devices, as well as a lack of digital literacy skills to even use the technology to access this information. And this next question for dialogue may seem a little bit redundant after spewing out those numbers, but I'm wondering, what do you believe leads to the digital divide?
Part of it is a generational thing. I think that even today's students, like kindergartners, if they're in a household with a parent or a grandparent, so somebody, especially in minority communities, you've got grandparents raising or care providers for their grandchildren. They don't have the technology knowledge, even if they have it and they know how the equipment works. So that's added to the difficulties, especially a lot of minority communities are experiencing. Even if they have the internet, they don't know how to work it.
Yeah, Venus, you're hitting the nail right on the head. Reports kind of use the terminology of adoption. So one of the things that leads to the digital divide is an adoption issue, where students have insufficient digital literacy skills or even language barriers that create impediments to them to being able to actually effectively access and use this technology, even if they have it, right? And I saw it firsthand when, okay, we think that we solve these problems by just giving out devices, but then if I don't know how to use it, turn it on, or the people around me who may be older, who I am in care of, don't know how to use it, what good is this machine if we don't actually know what it does, right? If my grandmother can't find the Zoom link for me to click in and to hear my lesson, Just because I have adequate internet and a computer that can get me there doesn't mean that I'm actually going to get there. So you're totally correct, Venus. Thank you. Alexa, you bring up another point, right? That children could be asked to help with housework, childcare, etc. And I think this is something that doesn't really get captured in many of the reports, but it is such a unfortunately common lived experience that not everyone was pushed into a home that allowed them to have their own private space or even allowed them to have all of those free hours and time to just even to study, right? Because if I'm the oldest of multiple children and my parents or guardians are off working or doing something else, maybe I become the new parent or the parent in this space to where I have to be responsible for assisting the others to help them. Or we even saw many students in stories where students were actually going to work to try to help keep food on their families' tables and to keep a roof over their heads. So they didn't even also have time to access this. And I think that it does ultimately lead to this divide. All right, Latoya, she offered geographical reasons, rural areas with poor internet strength and speeds. Yes, another one, you hit it right on the head, because another one of the main issues with that lead to the digital divide is also availability and reliability of broadband service. And that mostly impacts our students in rural areas and even our Native American students. And I think the other leading cause in the digital divide, as reports have shown, is affordability. When we think about how much it costs to have high-speed internet in your homes, how much it costs to have laptops, hotspots, et cetera, that those things add up quickly. And so if I'm having to choose between my rent payment and internet, maybe I'm going to choose to just keep the rent or to keep the lights on rather than also the internet. And so now that we have kind of talked about what leads to it and the numbers around it, I want to take a moment. Sorry, I'm not quite sure why my slides keep changing in the wrong direction, but thank you for bearing with me. So we know that the digital divide exists. We know, and we talked about kind of what leads to it. I do want to spend some time just even talking about the impact and why it's important to this conversation and why this digital divide is so significant. And it is significant for a myriad of reasons, right? Because the digital divide leads to lower academic achievement. Remember, you can't learn what you can't access, but also think about how much we do with the internet. We are even having this conversation today by virtue of the fact that we all have devices, whether that be computers, whether that be cellular devices that have allowed us to connect in, right, to this opportunity. We have kept our connection in order to be able to hear all of the words. And so if you are in a situation where you don't have those things or you don't have that internet, you're missing out on things. Students that have internet and devices can do so much more. They can conduct research. They can create online documents. They can complete and even submit assignments. They can watch educational videos, even read books online or even articles. It is literally a world wide web out there of availability for students who can actually get plugged in. And those who cannot tend to achieve lower. Also, we've been talking a lot about the gap in learning, and that leads to significant learning loss. It's reported that the COVID learning loss that even just looking from March 2020 to June of about 2021, it's estimated that that loss in learning amounts to 7 to 14 months of learning loss. So that's at least almost one academic year, if not 2 full academic years, that a student is missing, a gap in their knowledge. And think about how much you learn year to year, especially in the K through 12 setting, specifically pre-high school, right? Those are your foundational years in which everything scaffolds and builds off of it. And if you're missing 1 to 2 years, and that's only just a portion of the COVID learning loss, because we know we're still dealing with the impacts of this pandemic, and who knows when we'll ever be fully clear from it. And recognizing that this gap, this 7 to 14 months of learning loss, the extent of it really depends on the level of disconnection. And keep in mind that this disconnection disproportionately impacts our students of color and those from lower income neighborhoods. Not only have we experienced a learning loss, we've also seen that it has increased the high school dropout rates, and which represents its own loss in and of itself. The digital divide also decreases engagement that students can have with their peers as well as their teachers. Students who have internet and access from devices that operate more than just what a cell phone can do, they're able to email their teachers, they're able to video chat and message their peers and to collaborate about coursework. Overall, they're able to just get greater support and to help. They may be able to access different additional interventions that are available if you have online access, or if you have the appropriate devices, because we know that while cell phones are amazing and they can do many things, they can't do everything. I would also say that probably a even more significant impact is that it perpetuates the lack of digital skills and core competencies. And as our world evolves and we see that technology continues to dictate how we do life, having digital skills are going to be essential for students as they grow and hopefully enter into our workforce in various sectors. And your amount and level of digital skills may end up dictating how high our students can even ascend in our workforce. Now, when I say the term digital skills, I know many of you may be thinking, well, these kids, they stay on their phones all day. They know how to use social media because they're on there doing those TikTok dances and doing all of the things. But digital skills is much more than that. This term really reflects expertise with the internet. Yes, social media is included, but it's also other related technologies and the skills gained throughout those mediums. And those skills have a much broader implication, because some have argued that the level of individuals' digital skills are actually related to their work efficiency, effective communication skills, and even skills in managing and evaluating information. And evaluating and managing information, we know, is such an important skill as we navigate this current misinformation crisis that Eduardo highlighted in his talk on Monday. And so this decreased digital skills as well as core competencies ultimately leads us to this last impact that I'll highlight, which is the digital divide negatively impacting lifetime earning potential. That lower academic achievement, i.e. a lower GPA, is reported to correlate to about a 4 to 6% lower potential earning over a student's lifetime as a result of that lower academic achievement. But I think it goes well beyond that, right? When we think about the correlation between a lower skill set and being able to do lower level jobs versus higher managerial things and things of that nature. And so I'd like to pose some additional questions here as we come to the near end of our time. My question is, how can this digital divide be closed? And kind of going off Patrice's question, can it be closed? And if it can be, and who should be responsible for closing it?
Earlier, Andy put in the chat something about corporations or high-tech companies who are trying to block it. I think it is a responsibility of the, I guess, manufacturers or the creators of systems to make it available to disadvantaged neighborhoods and communities. So I think in this sense, corporate America, not the government, can help this problem.
Thank you, Venus and Andy. Big corporations, they should be responsible, or at least not create structures to make it not possible. Anyone else want to either echo those sentiments or challenge them? Any alternative ideas?
Natasha, when I think about this, I think about who are the people and what systems benefit the most from this inequity. Those should be the first folks in line to fix the problem. And so I think that corporate structure definitely fits within that. But I think we have to take a step back and take a step into our DEI space and look at the role of white supremacy, the role of capitalism, the role of historic marginalization of people, and really start to knock down some of those houses before we can even create realistic and meaningful systems of uplift, because it'll literally just be like putting a Band-Aid on top of a hemorrhaging wound. You know, the systems themselves need to be dismantled and rewritten.
Thank you so much for that, Patrice. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, let's put it on those who have benefited historically from this inequity to say, hey, you have enjoyed the fruits of this inequitable system. Let's use those fruits to make things fair again. So we have Jacqueline chiming in to say, educational institutions, especially when it comes to teaching students how to navigate technology and platforms, even such as Canvas. I agree, right? So we bring students into this environment and we know that they are open and need lessons, right? They may have their own skill set. They're not going to come to us empty. However, we're going to be introducing new things to them. And so if we are inviting them into a system in which these are the platforms and the technologies that we use, yes, the onus should be on those institutions that are inviting these students in to educate them on how to actually function, and really being also committed to long-term learning. How many of us have gone and done orientation trainings or clicked through something just so that we can get the credential to use a thing, only to find out that maybe I actually don't know how to use this as well as I need to, and how much we could benefit from some additional learning in that space. So I agree. I'd also offer here that I think our governments and our public education school systems have attempted to stand up and to say that they are going to try to combat this digital divide. So we know when in 2020, the pandemic hit, our schools went to remote learning, and you probably read a lot of headlines. In mid-2020, the Ohio state government actually set aside $50 million of state funding that it received from the federal government through the CARES Act to provide hotspots and internet-enabled devices to students. And drilling that $50 million down even further, right here with the Cincinnati Public School District, they received over $150,000 for these efforts. likely because they recognize that their students, as those who are captured by the categories in which the disproportionate effect of this divide covers, to say, hey, we need some support here, because if we expect our students to be able to learn, they can't learn what they can't access. So let's just give them access in these actual tools. So we see that governments have tried, or the government at the state as well as the federal level have attempted to just try to give direct cash to get direct technologies here. But I love that this conversation has also put the onus on big corporations to get involved in these efforts, that it cannot just solely be the government alone. Any final thoughts that anybody wants to kind of chime in here before I kind of wrap up our conversation? Okay. So I want to thank you all for being a part of this discussion today. And I want to leave you all with a reminder and a charge that we received from Coretta Scott King. She once stated that I must remind you that starving a child is violence, neglecting school children is violence, punishing a mother and her family is violence, discrimination is violence, contempt for poverty is violence. My hope is that we never become so numb and desensitized that we accept violence as just the way things have been and that they will always be. But instead, I charge us all to continue confronting crisis with radical solutions until there has been significant social change and we are all liberated. Thank you. And before I yield the floor, I do want to just do a, I guess, shameless plug and reminder to reiterate that these events this week, Eduardo and myself, were just a preview. So if you enjoyed these conversations this week, know that there is more coming. Next week is Research and Innovation Week. In particular, on March 31st, it will be Ethics Day, where a day-long slew of presenters will be grappling with other hot topics and issues that we're facing ultimately here as we confront crisis.
All right. Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you for the plug for Ethics Day. It was a wonderful discussion. If you're interested in continuing these kinds of conversations, please feel free to visit our website, cincyethics.org, sign up for our email list, and whenever we're coming together to have conversations about this, you'll get a little email about it. Make sure to check out Ethics Day. There's several interesting DEI related things happening. There's going to be a session on leadership and allyship. John Fort, co-host of Tech Check at MSNBC or CNBC, sorry, is going to be talking about leadership in crisis, but he's also going to be talking a little bit about an online course he developed called The Black Experience in America. So I encourage you to, if you're interested in these kinds of topics, especially check that one out. Again, Natasha, thank you. And I put a little form in the chat. If you could just give us a little feedback on your thoughts about this presentation. And it's also got some questions. I'm starting to try to gather information about your perceptions of the ethical culture here at the University of Cincinnati. So please take time to fill that out if you have a chance. And again, Natasha, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think we got a few minutes here, so I'll stick around if anybody had questions or wanted to dialogue a little further, but there's no pressure.
I'll stick around and keep this room open too.
Okay.
Natasha, on that thing that I was saying about the large tech companies lobbying, there was this, do you remember when they switched TV over to like digital and we all had to get new satellites or whatever, new antennas? Well, that basically, that freed up what they called the white spaces, not race related spaces, but white spaces in the sense that there were these big open bands of spectrum that the old TV signals were being bounced across. And there was a movement called Free the White Spaces, where the idea was just let that be like something that anyone can broadcast over. And what it would have done is it would have basically anybody could create a radio and we could create our own communal high-speed internet that would just go across these TV waves. But it would have basically made high-speed internet free, communal across the country. It would
Wow.
have decimated internet service providers. There would have been no market for anybody to pay for high-speed internet ever again. And Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, they lobbied hard to the federal government to auction that space off to a private company. And so now private companies own those white spaces. That was back in 2000. That would have been free high-speed internet for the entire country.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I was pretty upset about that. I was
Yeah, I mean, looking back and thinking about where the country ended up going, right? Who would have known 20 years later that we would be confronting this particular crisis, right? In the sense that we all went home, literally the workforce, the school system, everyone went home, and
no.
we needed high-speed internet everywhere in order to continue functioning. And how much easier and more seamless could that have been had capitalism not reigned?
Yep.
Thanks so much for that.
It was really good talk. Really good presentation. Loved it.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, those who are sticking around, any other comments, questions? We got about 3 minutes before this room will self-destruct.
I'm gonna stop recording.